Hi, everyone. We'll start in just a minute or two. We're just giving some other people a chance to log on. Hi, we're going to start in just a second. Can everyone hear? I'm seeing some things in the chat that people are not able to hear, but that might have been because we weren't talking. Okay, great.
Okay, let's get started. We are excited that everyone has joined us this afternoon. My name is Ruben Tarajano, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our report launch, webinar, and virtual panel discussion for A Portrait of California, 2021-2022, Human Development and Housing Justice. Before I turn things over to our speaker and panelists, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar and discussion is scheduled for 90 minutes, ending at 11 a.m. Pacific time, and the session will be recorded. The audience lines will be in a listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to submit questions for speakers throughout the session. As you think of them by clicking on the Q&A link, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will address as many questions as time permits. Simultaneous translation in Spanish is available. To listen in Spanish, locate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select the Spanish channel. Habrá interpretación simultánea a inglés a español durante toda la presentación. Para escuchar en español, localice el icono de interpretación. Está en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Seleccione su canal Spanish Español y seleccione Mute Original Audio para silenciar el audio original y escuchar solamente la interpretación al español. Si desea hacer un comentario o una pregunta, puede escribirlos en el recuadro de preguntas y respuestas QA y las intérpretes se lo interpretarán al inglés a los ponentes. Now I'm going to turn things over to Kristen Lewis, Measure of America's co-founder and director.
Thank you so much, Ruben. So I'm so thrilled to be here today to tell you all about A Portrait of California 2020-2021. I'm Kristen, Director of Measure of America. Today we will just go through the report. It will be kind of a fast tour. It's has lots of things in it, so I wish we could cover all of them, but I'll do my best. Then we will have a panel discussion. about the report, and we'll also open it to questions and comments from all of you. And then we will start wrapping up around 10:45. So we hope to get you out of here by 11 at the latest, or for your time by 1. Sorry, I'm having trouble with math. Okay, so just to say a few things, first of all, my colleagues and I are so grateful for the confidence of our donors and partners, and truly honored to have had the opportunity to produce this third report on California. So sincere thanks to our 7 core funders, without whom this project would not be possible. Several have been with us from the first Portrait of California 2011, and we're so grateful to them for their continued support, collaboration, and enthusiasm. We are also tremendously grateful to the 25 local funders listed here that have joined forces to support the production of in-depth county and regional reports under the overall Portrait of California umbrella. These supplemental reports will be released over the next few months. We are tremendously grateful and honored that Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins wrote the foreword to this report. We are deeply indebted to our incredible advisors. They were unbelievably generous with their time and ideas. They've saved us from ourselves on more occasions than we can count. But of course, all of the mistakes are ours. And then I would be remiss if I did not thank the fabulous Measure of America team, whose dedication and creativity never fail to amaze me. I include as part of this team our special advisor, Bill Pitkin. He's an authority on both housing and California, and his expertise was crucial to this report. Just a short word about who we are. Measure of America is a project of the Social Science Research Council, which is a nearly 100-year-old organization dedicated to mobilizing social science for the public good. Our team works with partners across the country to write reports like this one, as well as to create online mapping and data visualization tools like the Latino Power Map. And we do research on youth disconnection. So with this report, we really hope to do the following. We wanted to assess progress over time since our first report in 2011. We wanted to understand comparative well-being of different racial and ethnic groups, women and men in different parts of the state using our Human Development Index. And we wanted to understand and explore the ways in which housing, which is such an important issue in California, affects people's ability to lead flourishing lives. We also wanted to understand how COVID-19 was affecting vulnerable Californians. So just to note, this data we have in this report is from 2019 on the eve of the pandemic, but we did our best to weave much more current data into the report so that we could explore COVID-19. The data from COVID-19 period is really not going to be available till next year, probably at the earliest. So yeah, so that we're doing our best in that way. So just to say a little bit about what is human development and what is this idea that inspires and guides this work. Apologies to those of you who've heard it before. So the human development approach, human development is an optimistic and hopeful concept that puts human freedom and human dignity at the center. It emphasizes the everyday experience of ordinary people. So it's really about what regular people can do and be in their life. So whereas traditional approaches to measuring progress, like GDP, ask the question, how is the economy doing? The human development approach asks us how people are doing. So this idea draws heavily on the work of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, using his capabilities approach as a conceptual framework. So capabilities are basically our toolkit for leading a freely chosen, rewarding life. And this idea of human development was pioneered at the United Nations, and our work is based on the UN Human Development Report series. So just to say that we measure the same areas as the Human Development Report, the Global Human Development Report of the UN, but we use different indicators and our scale is different as well. So another important idea underpinning our work in general and explored in this report in particular is the concept of human security. Whereas human development can be thought of as the freedom to live a freely chosen, flourishing life, human security can be thought of as freedom from. So freedom from chronic and sudden threats to our lives, our rights, our safety, and our dignity. And the trials of 2020 and 2021, pretty much biblical in scope and severity, really made the need for human security abundantly clear. So this concept of human development is very far-reaching. It includes all the things that shape our opportunities, from our family situation to our religious beliefs to the environments in which we live. But there's no way to measure all of those things at once. So the Human Development Index measures just 3 core capabilities: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. A long and healthy life is measured using life expectancy at birth. We calculate that ourselves using California Department of Public Health mortality data. Access to knowledge is measured by a combination of degree attainment for the population age 25 and older, and school enrollment for the population age 3 to 24. So we get in preschool and college, as well as the years of compulsory schooling. And a decent standard of living is measured by median personal earnings. So median personal earnings are the wages and salaries of all workers ages 16 and above. And those last 2 indicators both come from the American Community Survey of the US Census Bureau. So we put these 3 indicators on the same scale, we add them together and divide by 3, and presto, we have the American Human Development Index score, which falls on a scale from 0 to 10. And the index provides us a way to pinpoint inequalities in well-being between different groups and geographies, and it supplies a straightforward way to track change over time. So, talking about change over time. So, from our first report in 2011 to now, the score for California has increased from 5.46 to 5.85. So that's good news. But after a decade of research, it's very clear to us that while many Californians are living longer, earning college degrees at higher rates, and making higher wages than the average American, these high statewide averages conceal inequities that emerge when we look at the data by race and ethnicity, gender, nativity, and locality. So just looking at the overall trend, during this time, life expectancy in California rose by a full year, but this increase really took place in the first half of that decade. And since 2012, life expectancy has fallen slightly to 81 years. In terms of education, in 2009, nearly 1 in 5 Californians did not have a high school degree, 25 and up. And by 2019, that number had dropped to 16%. So again, more progress. And median personal earnings increased between 2009, when California was still really digging its way out of the Great Recession, to 2019. So it rose, adjusted for inflation, from around 35,000 to around 39,000. But if we look at those lines on the top, we see that of the state's 6 major racial and ethnic groups, only 2, Latino and Asian Californians, have seen improvements in overall well-being. So Latino Californians experience the greatest increase of Human Development Index of any racial or an ethnic group, from 3.99 in 2011 to 4.81 now. And if you look back over 20 years of progress, their score has increased by 37%. And Latino women in particular have made very fast progress, 40% over the last 20 years. The score for Asian Californians has also increased. During this time, white Californians were basically treading water in terms of well-being. Their score didn't move too much. But the score for Black and Native American Californians have declined between 2009 and 2019. And the situation is particularly grave for Native American Californians. So over the last 20 years, their score has declined an alarming 22.5%. This is the sharpest drop we've seen in California or actually anywhere else we've studied. This is the first year for which we have an HDI score for Native, Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islanders. The abbreviation is NAHOPI. So we can't say what's happened over time with that group, but we can talk about how they're doing now. So here we see scores by race and ethnicity and by gender. Asian men and women have the highest scores, followed by white men and women. And then there's a substantial well-being drop, with Black, Latino, Nahopi, and Native American Californians having scores that fall below the California average. Black, Latina, Native American, and Nahopi women all score higher than their male counterparts, whereas white and Asian women score lower because there's a very large earnings gap in that group. And of course, these racial and ethnic categories are not monolithic. They have tremendous diversity within them in terms of national origin and nativity. So I'll just give an example of Asian Americans. So Asian Americans have the highest score, but if we disaggregate by Asian subgroup, as we have done throughout the report, we see that Taiwanese Californians have a super high score, 9.58, whereas the Hmong score is below the California average at 4.33. And the same is true for Laotian and Cambodian Californians. And so let's just talk about this for just 1 second. Why do we see this kind of pattern? And we see these kind of disparities in California over time and in the other states we've worked in. So Native American Californians, Black, Latino, Nahopi Californians, Californians from some Asian subgroups have much lower scores than white Californians, not by happenstance. It didn't just happen, magically, but this is because of decisions that people in power, most of them white, made over centuries. So these decisions were designed to capture and maintain economic, social, and political dominance, largely through violence, and they continue to affect well-being outcomes today. So we have a whole section in the report on this, and I hope it puts these scores into a historical context in a way that's useful. Okay, so now let's go to place. So what you see here is obviously a map of California with scores by what we call neighborhood clusters, or what the Census Bureau calls public use microdata areas. So these are Census Bureau defined geographies of at least 100,000 people, and California has 265 of these. They're created by dividing up populous counties. So LA has 69 of them, and by combining less populous rural counties. So you can see at the top of California, Northern California, the ways in which different counties have been combined. And darker colors represent higher levels of human development, and lighter colors represent lower scores. So at the top, we see San Ramon and Danville in Contra Costa County in the Bay Area. And at the bottom, we see the East Vernon neighborhood of the city of Los Angeles. So one scores 3.01, the other 9.51. So what does this mean kind of in practical terms? Well, what it means is that a resident of San Ramon or Danville can expect to live about 6 years longer. They are nearly 20 times as likely to have a bachelor's degree, and they have median personal earnings that are about 4 times as high as a resident of East Vernon in the city of Los Angeles. The neighborhood clusters with the highest scores are in urban and suburban areas along the coast, and the 10 neighborhood clusters with the lowest scores are a mix of urban and rural areas with concentrations in the San Joaquin Valley, San Bernardino County, and Los Angeles County. And Los Angeles is home to the greatest range, the lows and highs. So another lens that we apply to understanding well-being by place is what we refer to as the 5 Californias. These are created by grouping those neighborhood clusters we just talked about, not by geography. It's not the north-south California divide or the coastal inland divide, but rather by the scores on the Human Development Index. So the 5 Californias offer a way to make sense of the state and get a better grasp on how Human Development Index scores translate into the day-to-day realities and real-life opportunities of regular people. So we have 1% California. When we started this, that was 1% of the population. Now it's 2%. Those are areas scoring above 9. Elite Enclave California scores between 7 and 9. Main Street California are places that score between 5 and 7. Struggling California scores between 3 and 5 on the scale, and disenfranchised California are places scoring less than 3. So we pioneered this approach in our first California report in 2011, and we just thought it was a good way to sort of represent the fact that the residents of these different Californias have access to really distinct opportunities and face very different challenges, and that their lives are really lived in ways that make them appear to be quite separate from one another. So some good news is immediately apparent here. Today, no California neighborhood cluster meets the criteria for disenfranchised California. So all of them now score 3.0 or above on the 10-point HDI scale. In the 2011 report, 11 neighborhood clusters, which accounted for about 5% of the population, were part of disenfranchised California. So the fact that none of those neighborhood clusters now fall below 3.0 is really a cause for celebration. Nonetheless, we've kept the category for a couple of reasons. First, the historical continuity. Second, we're concerned that COVID-19's impact on well-being indicators may result in some places falling back into disenfranchised California. We've noticed the decline in well-being among Native Americans, for instance, and it could very well happen by place as well. It will kind of depend on the policy decisions that we make as a society. And third, certain populations such as homeless Californians, there are 160,000 Californians sleeping at night on the street. And also Californians living in census tracts characterized by deep poverty and isolation from the mainstream are really still living in precarious circumstances. So statewide, 611 census tracts score below 3. I'm going to slow down. I'm a fast-talking New Yorker, so I'm going to dial back. So we've kept the category for those reasons. And just to say that all 30 rural neighborhood clusters are part of either struggling or Main Street California. None of them are found in elite or 1% California. And we've tried throughout the report to give some focus on rural areas, which are so often overlooked. So this is just kind of a capturing of the different statistics related to the 5 Californias in terms of occupations, race and ethnicity, and the percentage of the population. And here we have some important housing indicators with regard. One thing that's quite striking is that aside from 1% California that has higher home ownership rates, the other Californians have really similar home ownership rates. We're also seeing high burdens, high rental burdens up and down the scale, though of course it's the worst in struggling California. So that's the overall index. And now we'll just look very quickly at the different components of the index and how they have changed over time. So in terms of race and ethnicity, we have it here on the screen in front of you. Health is our most fundamental capability. If we aren't alive, none of our other capabilities will help us very much. And life expectancy at birth is our proxy. 2 concepts are very important for this analysis. The first is the notion of the social determinants of health, which are the circumstances in which people are born, grow up, live, work, and age. And the second is the concept of health equity. Health equity basically means that everyone should have an equal opportunity to live a long and healthy life. So what we see here is that women live longer than men across all racial and ethnic groups. There is a biological advantage that women have, but then social factors also make a difference. Men engage in more risk-taking behaviors. They are less likely to seek medical care and so forth. And we see an astonishing 22 years separating the life expectancies of Asian women and Native American men in the state. And again, Asian Americans are not a monolithic group. So here we see life expectancy by Asian subgroup in California, with Hmong people living 75.5 years and much higher life expectancies for some other Asian groups. Oh, and one thing also to note here, to note in the previous one, is that Native American life expectancy has fallen by 8 years since 2012. So that is a very alarming and distressing finding. So now we'll just look a little bit about the way in which the conditions of people's daily lives really has influenced their susceptibility to COVID. So we found that COVID rates are higher in counties with larger households. So there's been a lot of discussion about overcrowding. That's definitely a factor. Even more a factor we found is just having a large household. Living with a lot of people, you're exposed to the indoor air of a lot of other people, and that increases the rate of COVID. We see this really strongly in terms of incarcerated people. So there have been a huge number of COVID cases among the incarcerated population in California. And so again, this is just speaks to the idea of how people's exposure has varied so much. And one thing that's really striking is the differences between the way in which affluent Californians were able to protect themselves from COVID-19, not entirely, of course, not all of them, to a degree unattainable by those whose livelihoods really require their physical presence, delivery workers, people working in drugstores, people who care for the elderly, and the disproportionate exposure of low income as well as Black and Latino Californians is really tragically apparent in the roles of those lost to COVID-19. And so this is just to show some comments. We were really struck in the past by the stories of people who aren't really captured in the statistics as very well, homeless people, young people aging out of foster care, people who are undocumented, that their reality is not well represented in the data. So for this report, we did a lot of interviews. We hired journalists so that we could bring those voices in. And I'm really struck by the first one I mentioned earlier, the gender difference in terms of health-seeking behaviors. And this guy said he could have stayed with family, but he had to move on. He's a man. He had to take care of himself, and he would stay in his vehicle and cry and hope things got better. That was a very heartbreaking quote to all of us at Measure of America. Okay, I just have two more to go through. Access to knowledge. So education matters for better jobs and bigger paychecks, but it also matters for health, stable relationships, agency and autonomy, and the real freedom a person has to decide how to live and what to do. We measure this by access to formal education. It's really important to note that there are shortcomings to this proxy. It doesn't capture all the other ways of knowing that people and communities possess, ways of knowing that are sources of dignity, strength, and even survival. So access to knowledge includes people's capability to learn about all the things that shape their options and affect their quality of life. Big picture questions like how society works, or who to trust, or who you are in the world, and even mundane things like how to set the table or cook a meal or sew on a button. So these fundamental sources of knowledge are not captured in the index, but that doesn't mean that they aren't critically important. So here we see education by race and ethnicity. Asian Californians have the highest score for education, and Latino Californians the lowest. But there's a lot of variation by national origin in terms of the education score, and also by nativity. So US born Latinos earn high school degrees and so forth at about the same rate as other Californians. And this reflects the education system that people are coming from. So a lot of people who had come initially from elsewhere who are Latino just didn't have access to education in the same way in their home country. Here we see once again that neighborhood cluster map, and we see these same two areas that had scored highest and lowest for the Human Development Index overall. Looking at the impact of COVID, of course, school systems made the best decisions they could with the limited knowledge they had, but California schools were closed longer than schools in other states. And this has had a disproportionate impact on people who are already facing the greatest educational challenges. And we see a lot of variation by state. So this is showing the rate of the share of students learning virtually over the last year. And you can see that there are places where almost everybody was the whole time and places where there was more of a mix. So that's just important in terms of moving forward. In terms of education, another important issue is youth disconnection. That's the rate of 16 to 24-year-olds who are out of school and out of work. It's a very important indicator of human well-being. And in California, we see a lot of variation by ethnicity. This we see nationally as well, with Black and Native American young people having the highest rates of youth disconnection. And it also varies a lot by geography across the state, ranging from just 2.6% in Westwood and West LA, which makes sense because UCLA is there, all the way up to 28% in Del Norte, Lassen, Modoc, Plumas, and Siskiyou counties. So we did see nationally and in California that rates of youth disconnection tend to be the highest in rural areas. And in terms of a decent standard of living, I'm going to focus a lot now on the differences by race and ethnicity. There are big gender earnings gaps in all racial and ethnic groups. They're the largest for white and Asian Californians. And why is that? You know, there are a lot of reasons why women earn less, from the kinds of things they study to the differential impact of parenthood and caregiving. We've seen this unbelievably in terms of in COVID times, to things like wage discrimination, work culture, and so forth. And just to spotlight one of those, sort of the differential impact of parenthood, there was a study that showed that basically for every child a man has, his salary increases by 6%. For every child a woman has, her salary decreases by 4%. So, you know, that's one reason that we have the wage gaps that we do. We also see these racial and ethnic gaps even by occupation. You might think, well, maybe certain groups are concentrated in higher paying jobs, and they are to some degree, but even in the highest paid sector, management, business, and science and the arts, Latino women earn the least, Asian men earn the most by a huge margin. I mean, look at that giant range. And then you see it kind of across, even in service sector, which is the lowest paying, white men are still earning the most in that group. And these are just earnings by neighborhood cluster. All of the top scoring neighborhood clusters are in the Bay Area, and the lower scoring ones are in Los Angeles and the San Joaquin Valley. And this is also quite striking that basically in every metro area in California, or the largest 20 or so, we found that white workers earned above the median for that place, and Latino workers earned below the median for that place. And that was consistent across the metro areas in California. Now just to move on to housing briefly, before I wrap up. You know, housing really matters for everything. Where we live determines where our kids go to school, our social networks, if we can exercise safely, can we get groceries, can we get to work easily, the kind of jobs we have, and the kind of policing that we experience in our neighborhood. And I think something that's very important to emphasize is that residential segregation in California is so widespread and deeply entrenched that it seems kind of almost unavoidable, but it's really anything but. You know, the present day landscape of inequality was built by the deliberate policies and decisions that powerful people put into action. Most of these people were white, of course, often through violence committed or endorsed by the state. So today's residential segregation was historically and socially constructed, and new, better policies can create a different future for us. So this map shows the extent of native lands before European contact, and the one on the right shows Native American lands today. So Native Americans, as well as Asian, Black, and Latino Americans, Californians, sorry, have really suffered grave harms from past segregation policies. And that basically for hundreds of years, the power structure, largely white, has used strategies to maintain, capture and maintain economic, political, social, and cultural dominance. So I'm sure you've all seen these. These are these redlining maps. This is Los Angeles. These are maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation from the 30s. And the red areas were identified as risky. Those risky areas were areas where Black and Latino people lived, also immigrants. And you can see how the areas that were red then, in terms of segregation, are still very segregated today. And the green areas that you see on the top of the map, and then if you look at the dot map, which shows racial and ethnic groups, that blue color at the top, it represents the white population. The yellow color is Latinos. The green is Black Angelenos, and pink is Asian and Pacific Islander Angelenos. So you see how the patterns from the past are really maintained today through laws and policies. I'm kind of out of time, so I just wanted to draw your attention to this kind of analysis that we have in the report about ownership rates by race and ethnicity. Asian and white families are not only more likely to own a house, but those houses tend to be worth more. In terms of rent burden, rent burden is something that half of Californians experience, but nearly 7 in 10 households headed by Black women face a high rent burden. So it's not a burden borne proportionally across the population. And so just to wrap up, when we create recommendations, we're really thinking of what will it take to improve the scores for all Californians, as well as close the well-being gaps and protect people from chronic and sudden threats. So 3 areas that run through all of our recommendations are helping the hardest hit groups recover from COVID-19, preparing for the next emergency by building human security, and addressing these structural fault lines that are behind these huge gaps in well-being scores. In terms of health, we need to lay the groundwork for longer, healthier lives. We have to improve access to knowledge all along the life cycle. And in terms of living standards and economic security, we have to address deep and persistent poverty, close the gender earnings and the racial earnings gaps, and so forth. In terms of housing, we made special recommendations based on housing. Since that's the theme, obviously we need to build new housing. There's been a lot of progress recently in recent months in California, but we can't stop there. It's something we have to keep on working toward. We have to protect the housing that we have and allow people or enable people to stay in their neighborhoods. We have to end homelessness in a variety of ways, and we need to build wealth. We have to support homeownership from those groups that were previously excluded from it. So that's it. I'm sorry I went over a bit. It's very hard, and I hope I wasn't talking too fast, but I probably was.
Thank you so much, Kristen. We have a few questions here in the chat, one of which being that you mentioned disparities based on race and nativity. Is that related? And Gary asks, is that related to language and limited English proficiency?
So the data that we have don't say why it is, but other research has shown that language proficiency is one factor in the disparity, in the earnings disparity, just in terms of the jobs people are able to get.
Thank you, Kristen. And I'd love to encourage our attendees to continue sending questions in the chat. You can find the button at the bottom of your screen, and our panelists will be able to see them. And someone did ask in the chat about our supplemental report on Sonoma. Would you be able to share more about that, Kristen?
Sure, I would be happy to. So we have been working with a great group of partners in Sonoma County to do a report on that county. We will present the scores by race, ethnicity, and gender and nativity, but also by census tract. So it's kind of a deeper dive. In 2014, we did a full report on Sonoma County. And so this is revisiting that, seeing where there has been progress. There'll be a kind of an undesigned sort of white paper version of the report available in a few weeks' time. And then our partners in Sonoma County are going to lead a process with local groups to identify recommendations and for an agenda for action. And once that's done, we'll release a whole designed version of the report that includes those recommendations that will come from the community.
Thank you, Kristen. We have another question here from Ryan. Do you see a possible overlay of the quote Great Resignation and its impact on California?
That's a great question. I mean, I think when we look at the kind of jobs different groups of people have access to, a lot of those jobs aren't very good. You know, they don't pay very well. They don't have good benefits. So it's possible that the COVID-19 impacts have kind of shifted a little bit maybe the balance of power between workers and employers, so that workers are in more of a position to kind of demand better conditions for working, pay, benefits, and all these things.
Thank you. And for the sake of time, I think we have room for one more question, and a very important one at that. Juan asks, what do you think has contributed to the decrease in HDI among Black and Native American Californians in the last decade?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think what we've seen in California is progress without equity. So even during COVID, when the economy was tanking, when low income and communities of color were experiencing devastating effects of COVID-19, the rich were getting richer. And so that makes it seem as though everything is improving for everyone. But looking by race and ethnicity shows us that it's not. In terms of what contributed to the decrease of the Human Development Index score, I think there's been an increase in deaths of despair. So we did see a decrease in life expectancy in both of these groups. So that's one reason. And another is just the sort of economic benefits and access to good employment has not been shared equally. And if anything, kind of middle-class jobs that would have provided a ladder up are disappearing increasingly. We have this now hourglass-shaped economy with more insecure service jobs, and then well-paying jobs for high-flying tech people and so forth. And so I think these communities have been quite left behind.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I think we are now going to move to our panel discussion. And Kristen, once again, I want to thank you for introducing the key findings and giving our attendees a very comprehensive scope on all that this report has to offer and what they can expect. So I am going to ask our panelists to go ahead and turn on their cameras if they are able. A big thank you to our moderator and all the panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise during our discussion. First, today we're joined by Henry Gascon, Director of Program and Policy Development for United Ways of California. Henry conducts policy research and analysis, leads communication strategies, and assists with organizational operations. He is a co-author of The Real Cost Measure in California, which reveals what it really costs to live in California when factoring the costs of housing, childcare, healthcare, food, transportation, and other basic needs. Previously, Mr. Gascon was a policy analyst at Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority and the director of Empower Los Angeles, a social service organization that provided technology education services for the Southern California nonprofit sector. He holds bachelor's degrees in history and international relations from Holy Names University in Oakland, California, and a master's in public administration, specializing in policy analysis, from the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service at New York University. Thank you, Mr. Gascon, for joining us. Our next panelist is Emily Skehan, Officer of Strategy for the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation. Emily Skehan provides strategic planning guidance across the programs department, supports initiative teams in centering equity in their grant making, conducts research and landscaping, and facilitates learning opportunities related to program and foundation-wide strategy. Skehan previously served as program officer, where she managed a portfolio of grants as part of the special programs team, and before that, as program associate for the Foster Youth Initiative. Prior to joining the Hilton Foundation, Skehan worked for Homeboy Industries, where she managed grant and fundraising activities for the largest nonprofit gang intervention program in the United States. Skehan also previously held research positions in civic participation and environmental advocacy nonprofits. She received her master's and bachelor's degrees in sociology from Stanford University. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. And our wonderful moderator is Adriana Noemi Saldivar, Program Manager of the Latino Community Foundation. Adriana leads the Latino Community Foundation's grant making and programming in the Central Valley. She supports local leaders in efforts to build power, increase civic engagement, and strengthen grassroots organizations in the Valley. She is passionate about immigrant and refugee rights, community-driven grant making, and cross-movement building. Adriana has over 10 years of experience in philanthropy, community organizing, and education. Prior to joining LCF, she spent 5 years at Open Society Foundations, where she served as a senior program specialist for the Immigrant and Refugee Rights Portfolio, coordinating a $10 million grant-making initiative. Concurrently, she was an activist and community organizer focused on lifting up the voices of undocumented youth and farm workers. Adriana holds a bachelor's degree in political science, Latin American studies, and Spanish literature, and an MA in international relations from Fresno State University. Adriana, of course, will be moderating our panel discussion, so I am going to turn things over to Adriana.
Thank you so much, Ruben. I want to extend my gratitude to the Measure of America team for inviting the Latino Community Foundation and me to be part of today's program. It's an honor to facilitate the conversation today with our wonderful panelists, Henry and Emily. Our discussion will focus on what it will take to improve the equity and well-being for all Californians. And to start the conversation, I also want to invite all of our participants today in this call to give us your questions in the chat box. And now turning to Henry and Emily with the first question, I would love for both of you to chime in. What do you see are the implications of this report on your work? And if we could start with Henry.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Adriana, and welcome to all of you who are joining us this morning. And I just want to thank Measure of America again for their outstanding work on this third human development study for California. I know a lot of research, writing, data crunching, and analysis was invested into the study, and we're profoundly grateful to talk with you about human development today. So the implications of a portrait of California are profound for United Way. Our mission is to improve lives by mobilizing the caring power of communities around the world to advance the common good. So what that means is that we help to strengthen the well-being of low-income children and families by improving their health, education, and financial stability results, which perfectly intersects the Human Development Index. So in fact, I don't know of any other study that better reflects how people are doing throughout California than a portrait of California, because its primary focus is on the opportunities people have and what they want to become of themselves. So Portrait of California isn't just another study that we want to rest on bookshelves. It's a shared living experience that speaks to the communities we live in and the role they play in our life expectancy, our ability to succeed in school, and to live in dignity through a livable wage. So if these aren't shared values among us here, I don't know what are. So for practically here for us at United Way, this study gives us the ability to further our role as a community convener with Measure of America to bring stakeholders together to discuss what we want out of our communities that we live in for our children and for our future. So in doing so, we can all use the Human Development Index as a framework to inform our advocacy work, our programmatic initiatives, philanthropic giving, and community investment strategies to help struggling Californians achieve the quality of life they so richly deserve.
Thank you, Henry. Emily, how will this report impact your work?
Thanks, Adriana. And similar to Henry, I just want to say, thank you for the opportunity to join this fantastic group of people today. And I want to acknowledge the meaningful contribution Measure of America has made to the field as a whole and to our work at the Hilton Foundation. We provide funds to nonprofit organizations working to improve the lives of individuals living in poverty and experiencing disadvantage throughout the world. The first portrait of California was released in 2011. Our then Vice President, Ed Kane, really understood the vision that Measure of America had. I think having a decade of this index and seeing the way the data has shifted over time has been incredibly valuable. It allows us to set priorities for the future that we can evaluate and revisit as future reports come in. And this report especially is so comprehensive and it has so much good stuff in it. There's disaggregation of Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. There's the history of displacement of Chicana communities in the Chavez Ravine. There's a really comprehensive look back at the last decade and I think a roadmap for the years ahead. Implications of this report, I think an overarching theme is that for the data up until 2019, we were seeing real progress around some of these key issues: reduction in youth disconnection, the disappearance of that category of disenfranchised California, but that progress was unevenly distributed in a way that reflected the historical impacts of racism, segregation, and disinvestment in certain communities. So now that we're beginning to sort out what the long-term impacts of the last 2 years will be, the information that we have about those communities that were made most vulnerable to the public health and economic effects of COVID, again, because of that legacy of exclusion and our continued choices to marginalize those communities, I think that information can provide markers for where we will need to do things differently and target investments to have an equitable recovery. Especially with, as a foundation that has a large initiative focused on our neighbors in Los Angeles experiencing homelessness, it was really helpful to see the theme of housing woven throughout the report and the explicit acknowledgement that the indicators that make up Human Development Index are all inextricably linked to each other, and that safe and affordable housing is a fundamental need if we want to see a healthy and equitable California.
Thank you, Emily. And I was just reminded that we came in with too much energy. So let's slow down to support our interpreters who are helping us make sure that the message doesn't get lost to our Spanish-speaking audience. And so moving on to the next question, we are still living in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that it has devastated Californians, impacting both our physical and our economic health. And we also know it has disproportionately impacted communities of color. The report identifies several areas for investment and action in closing those gaps that have been highlighted even more by the pandemic, such as standard of living or increasing economic security for low-income workers, improving population health, and eliminating health inequities. And also how to make educational more accessible to folks, just to name a few, right? Like the wish list of things that we want to take care for our communities. Could you pick one of the recommendations that was in the report and tell us what you think needs to happen in order for the needle to be moved on this issue? And we can start with Henry.
Great, thanks, Adriana. So one of the key recommendations from A Portrait of California can immediately be found in its subtitle, Human Development and Housing Justice. And there is no doubt that the cost and lack of access to housing is a significant barrier compromising Californians' abilities to rise in the Human Development Index. And that certainly has been exacerbated over the past year and a half with a pandemic. So the location of where we live has an impact on the air that we breathe, our access to quality schools, fresh and nutritious food, access to jobs, and more. And this is one of the reasons why we released our real cost measure study on what it takes to make ends meet in California this past July. And here we find that 33% of Californians struggle to meet basic needs, when you factor the cost of housing, childcare, healthcare, and other basic needs. So both a Portrait of California and the real cost measure speak to the fact that a significant number of households pay at least 30% of their income on housing. So in fact, we find that in our study, nearly 4 in 10 households pay at least 30% of their income on housing. And the further below you fall below the real cost measure, we see many families could easily pay 70 to 80% of their income just on housing alone. So a Portrait of California also reveals to us that approximately 45% of Californians are renters, about 6 million in total, which is the second highest rate in the country behind New York. So part of the challenge is that we spend $3 subsidizing homeownership compared to $1 for renters. So that's a clear opportunity for us to tackle housing disparities. And we all know that the cost of housing is incredibly hard to manage due to local zoning ordinances, historical discrimination, the lack of political will, and more. However, we like the idea of a refundable tax credit, refundable renter's tax credit, because it would help renters stay housed and would decrease the amount of turnover for landlords and potentially reduce the rate of homelessness over time. And just personally, I also wish that we can actually make Habitat for Humanity a federally subsidized program where we can incentivize families to own a home and giving them a role to build it in return for a down payment subsidy and other tax breaks. So A Portrait of California paints a picture that our homes over the past year and a half have not only been a shelter, but also a childcare center, and a workplace. And with respect to childcare, in our study with the real cost measure, we find that the cost of childcare can often exceed the cost of housing in many parts of the state, particularly in the Central Valley. So the need to reduce both housing and childcare costs in California will be instrumental in the years to come.
Thank you, Henry. Now, Emily, which one of the recommendations do you think can really help us move the needle? Or if you could pick one.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick one. But, I'm also going to talk about housing, and I actually want to read one of the recommendations. I really appreciated the way that we framed in the report housing as a public health issue. So the recommendation says expand access to safe and affordable housing. Unsafe housing and housing insecurity can have a tremendous impact on both physical and mental health. For instance, people experiencing homelessness, communities of color facing environmental injustice, and Californians residing in overcrowded living conditions all struggle with worse health outcomes. And I think this was just made so abundantly clear throughout COVID. I think the first step is really that our collective advocacy and investments have to address the root causes of housing insecurity and homelessness and really respect the dignity of those experiencing it. And that means acknowledging the inequitable practices and systems that resulted in the data that we see in the report, like the fact that households that are headed by Black and Native women are by far the most likely to be rent burdened. It means increasing funding for and reducing the costs of and barriers to permanent housing. It means preventing inflow from California's growing housing affordability crisis and the criminal legal system. I really appreciated the call out in the report around, one, the way that mass incarceration has disproportionately and severely impacted communities of color, and especially Black men in California. And two, the clear link between incarceration and later experiences of homelessness. We have a responsibility to use the resources we have historically spent on criminalizing people to instead provide things we know increase community safety and health, like housing assistance. A great example of this is there's a program called Breaking Barriers in Los Angeles County that provides housing stability and employment training support to individuals on probation using probation dollars on those services. So I think we have real opportunities to, again, use these resources that we've historically spent on things that we know don't increase community public health and instead invest them in things like housing. And then the need for these systemic solutions has only grown with COVID. And, there are opportunities to leverage federal funds from things like Section 8, state funds from some of the really exciting Medicaid innovations that are coming down, and local funds. Los Angeles had this Measure J, which again is about redirecting funds from things like incarceration to important services like housing. So, these policies under consideration could provide tens of thousands of Angelenos with permanent housing, evidence-backed services, and the supports and housing options they need.
Thank you, Emily. Completely agree on the housing issue. And I want to invite our audience to chime in on the chat box and tell us what you think as we're asking these questions and our panelists are sharing their thoughts. Like, share your thoughts. How do you see this report impacting your work, or which one of the recommendations really resonates with your work and you think we can move on that issue? For the next question, I'm going to go with Henry. And now that we have the report and we can't really ignore the racial inequities that we have in our systems and in our policies, Henry, how do you think we can actually accelerate conversations and really foster a dialogue with decision makers to address those inequities highlighted in the report?
Thanks, Adriana. So there's no doubt that the murder of George Floyd has changed our civic discourse on racial equity over the past year and a half. And the release of this third California Human Development Study is a powerful tool to help us just further understand the disparities, not only prevalent throughout the entire state, but also in our own local neighborhoods as well. And one of the findings that struck me is the Latino health paradox, where Latinos on average experience relatively high life expectancy, but lower lifetime earnings compared to other ethnic groups. And here we find, for example, that white men take home nearly $62,000 a year on average, while Latina women, the lowest paid group in the state, earn just over $25,000. So this is a profound finding, which speaks not only to the income and gender, not only to gender and income discrimination, but it also challenges us to think critically about how and why some populations live longer, but are poor longer. And what does that say about the quality of life for the struggling among us? So our own real cost measure also affirms part of that Latino health paradox, where we find that 52% of Latino households throughout the entire state don't earn enough to meet basic needs. And when we quantify that, that's about 1.7 million households. But there's also several other disparities that a portrait of California raises that should be red flags for many of us, including the fact that Native Americans have the shortest life expectancy in the state among the various ethnic groups, but they've also experienced an 8-year loss of life expectancy over the 8 years. So we need to learn more about why that's happened. That white women earn $20,000 less than white men. That 48% of foreign-born Latinos in the state have high school diplomas versus their US-born counterparts at 85%. So this speaks to the fact that we have to address inequities not only among racial groups, but also within them, and what we can do collectively to improve issues such as high incarceration rates among Black men, focus on better wraparound services for Indigenous communities, negating gender pay gaps, and more. So this isn't a community conversation that will end as we recover from the pandemic, but a generational one that addresses not only what kind of world we want to live in, but what we can do now, both individually and collectively, to ensure these disparities don't continue to perpetuate.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, we can't look away. Now we know too much. And Emily, for you, I have a different question on this round. From your experience, can you provide us with some concrete examples of cross-sector and place-based strategies or promising practices that address this type of challenges and that have the potential of improving the Human Development Index outcomes, HDI outcomes?
Yeah, thank you, Adriana. I think one great example that is covered, we talk in the report about youth disconnection. So that's young people who are sort of in that transition to adulthood, who are either out of school or out of work. And when you look at California as a whole, we actually look, quite in line with national averages, even a little bit below, with about 10% of young people experiencing disconnection. But when you drill down again, you see these racial and ethnic disparities. So double that rate for Black young people and almost double that rate for Native young people. A great example, I think, are, in 2015, the Obama administration launched these performance partnership pilots for disconnected youth. In LA, we call it LAP3. That first partnership launched in 2015, and the first phase concluded last year. The intention was really to give state, local, tribal governments more flexibility in federal fee waivers and funding and the way that they use those fundings. To improve outcomes for opportunity youth or youth who are disconnected. What we saw from those first 5 years was increasing collaboration between the systems and agencies that worked with opportunity youth. One outcome was the successful obtainment of this permanent WIOA waiver that brings in more flexible federal dollars. For the first time, we were able to use those dollars for young people who actually were in school or work, but who had been part of the juvenile justice or foster care systems and who hadn't historically been counted as disconnected youth. So the goal was to really bring in young people before they were disconnected. And it was really successful. You know, we saw like a 50% increase in the enrollment of youth who had experienced foster care or juvenile justice. And who had experienced housing insecurity. And it really shows us that, you know, collaboration with organizational and agency partners to affect systemic change was successful in getting young people engaged and moving forward in their education and employment goals. I also think in the coming years, we'll have opportunities to increase this kind of cross-agency work, and especially to create more places where the young people who have experienced these systems have decision-making power and formal input into how these systems work. When we're talking about youth who have experienced foster care, who have been in the juvenile justice systems, youth who are pushed out of high school, these are majority Black and Brown young people who deserve leadership roles as we work to streamline, in some cases, eliminate and improve these systems.
Thank you. And I want to add a little bit here, because so many of the things that you mentioned, Emily, really resonate with some of the work that I do with Latino Community Foundation. You know, we specifically work with grassroots Latino-led organizations across the state of California. And one of the things that is very clear to us is that moving the needle on any of these issues or advancing any of the recommendations that come in the report can happen if we try to do this work alone, right? It's really going to be done by people who are in those communities, not by people disconnected from them. So when we think about investing in local leadership, I really want to point out the local leadership of color in places like the Central Valley and the Inland Empire. We need to look at who's already on the ground doing the work and trust them. Trust that they know best the solutions for their community, because they themselves experience those issues. To them, it's not just a number on a piece of paper, but it's their lived experience and is their daily struggle. So how do we make space in our work to bring in those folks so that they are leading and that they share their vision, their dreams, and the solutions? We should not be doing anything for them without them. And so as we think of all of this, I also want to bring in the importance of building people power, to invest in community civic engagement, in organizing, in movement building. This often doesn't happen by some foundations, but I really want to push us to think about how we intentionally invest in people power. One of the things that it's important for us, a value that is part of our organization, but also one that guides my work, is this thought of change, not charity. Because we know that people on the communities that are hurting the most are not waiting around for somebody to come and rescue them. They are ready to be their own heroes and sheroes, and they have the capacity to advocate for themselves and for their families. And so what they might need support with is potentially an organizer to get them going, capacity building, leadership development. But trust me, communities of color have incredible potential. They are brilliant, they are natural leaders, and they are so ready to be unleashed. So investment should be happening in regions that need it the most. I live in Fresno, the heart of the Central Valley that gets pointed out in the report a lot. And I appreciate that we make those regional differences within the state. So for my funders in the audience, how are we as funders influencing our organizations to drive meaningful long-term resources to areas that have histories of underinvestment and neglect? And how do we use, all of us in this call, our levers to influence from anywhere that we sit so we can move the needle on equity? Just a thought. I want to make sure that if you have questions for the panel, or if you have any thoughts, you put them in that chat box or the Q&A question box. Going back to you, panel, I promise that was all I wanted to say. The next part is just my questions for you. So Emily, going back to you, can you share any insights that you have on how we center equity in your work, or how do we create opportunities to collaborate more effectively?
Thank you. And I'm mostly going to build on the remarks that you just made. First, I want to acknowledge that this has not been a long-term strength of philanthropic institutions. People doing work in communities know a lot more about this than we do. But I think that there are some great models of really putting people who have experience in systems at the center of the transformation of those systems. So I know my colleagues were incredibly proud to fund the inaugural cohort of the Corporation for Supportive Housing's Speak Up program, which trains people who have experienced homelessness as policy advocates. We also recently supported the launch of the Racial Equity and Homelessness Fellowship led by Social Justice Partners LA. This is a really incredible 9-month experience for BIPOC leaders in the homeless response sector across Los Angeles County who are committed to racial equity and justice. We consider this a long-term project to create a new community of leaders of colors to really build the bench and to transform the face of these systems. And we know these are people who are going to really put racial equity at the center of their work and practice. Another exciting opportunity for collaboration in the years ahead is this newly created LA County Youth Commission, where youth commissioners who have experience in the foster care and juvenile justice systems will have formal input and a real chance to talk about what would have made their experiences in those systems better. We've heard from young people, for instance, that the issues that they face around housing insecurity after exiting foster care are really urgent, but that the available housing options oftentimes have too many strings attached, aren't really appealing to them, or they're just simply too complex to navigate. So I think there's really important work to be done around listening to young people and changing the supports available to them to better reflect their strengths and what they say that they need.
Thank you. And I'm gonna do the final question. This is for both Henry and Emily. And then from that, again, if we have any questions from the audience, this is the time to put them in the Q&A box. But also, if anything that you're hearing is resonating with you, make sure you engage and let us know in the chat box. So Henry, going back to you, I want us to think collectively about what a vision for California, a future California could look like. If the recommendations in the report were to be implemented, what are 2 or 3 things that would be different and better for Californians by, say, 2030, especially for those that are struggling the most today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as Kristen noted earlier this morning, the Human Development Index speaks about the aspirational endeavors of human development on what kind of world we want to live in. And that's what compelled the United Nations to release its first Global Human Development Report over 30 years ago, and is still regularly published today, has framed Millennium Development Goals for us at the turn of the century. And that's why even during the World Cup, some television broadcasters list the human development scores of the countries facing each other, which stimulates great conversation to better understand the people watching them from the bleachers and from behind the TV screens. So just given this, I think the first item on my wit list, albeit a bit of a pipe dream, is to have US TV networks display human development scores on broadcast so we can begin a national conversation on human development and not make HDI not only an internationally recognized standard, but a more accepted one here in the US. So we have a great opportunity with the Summer Olympics coming up in a few short years here in California, so we can celebrate the countries by getting to know the people behind them as well. And my second recommendation is, for all of us here, is let's not let the portrait of California findings remain on this webinar or a PDF download on your computer or on your bookshelf. Let's use this release as an opportunity to talk about human development with our family members, fellow nonprofits, foundations, electeds, and other public service partners on what we can do to collectively create our own 2030 human development goals. So even looking at our own neighborhood, let's look at the life expectancy there and let's figure out what can we do to help improve life expectancy by 2 years in our neighborhood? And what are the steps that we're going to have to make in order to get there? How can we support disadvantaged students to complete their college education and pursue their own dreams? So we can't do this in silos, but only with the shared values that bring all of us gathered here today.
Thank you, Henry. And back to you, Emily. Let's dream together. What is possible for us moving forward so that we can actually implement some of these recommendations by 2030?
I think so many of the recommendations in the report are really hopeful and really grounded in reality. And I especially appreciated the through lines in the report around how the key pieces of the index, economic security, education, and health, they're so interconnected. The report makes the point we can't address the inequities in education without also really breaking down some of the longstanding practices that have led to extreme residential segregation. The report notes that Los Angeles is the 6th most racially segregated metro area in the US. So to begin with, I hope that in 2030, we've begun to confront some of that and really tease apart all of the things that make opportunity so unevenly distributed in California. I think one recommendation that really struck me was that only 1% of eligible expecting parents are currently accessing home visiting programs, which we know increase maternal health outcomes and child development and decrease the number of young people who enter the foster care system. So simply there, increasing funding for expecting parents so that young children, before they even enter our community, are getting the supports that they're really going to need to thrive later in life. There are so many great recommendations. I really encourage everyone to dive in and read the full report. And then it's time for us to make real strides to address the systemic issues that make it possible for things like the median earnings of a Latino woman to be $35,000 less than a white man. And for so many of our really talented young people who come from certain zip codes to be more likely to be disconnected from work and school. So I hope that we see increased investments in these things that we already know are going to increase public health for all of us. So I could go on for a while, but I think those are a few of the key opportunities that could be really transformational.
Thank you, Emily. And this is a good connection to one of the questions that we have from the audience. Pete sent us this question for both panelists. So the call EITC and Young Child Tax Credit, and especially the extension of eligibility to I-teen filers, that was won by advocates and has been a bright spot for immigrant communities. What do panelists think about this strategy of expanding cash support to working families? And Henry, we can start with you if you're ready.
Yeah, for the full sake of transparency, I work with Pete here at University of California. So obviously I'm a big champion of income supports for low-income families. And we're proud of the work that we've done with other partners to expand the California Earned Income Tax Credit. And we do that through several programs that we provide. We have a My Free Taxes program. So one of the things that we always try to do is, get low-income families to file their income taxes for free, right? And that's a great service. We also offer broadband services. We know in the report highlights this, there's a big disparities in terms of broadband internet access. So what are the things that we can do to collectively make sure that everybody is connected and to make sure that kids throughout the entire state who have especially been displaced over the past year and a half can get the resources that they need to succeed in school. So we're big champions of this, obviously.
Yeah, at the Hilton Foundation, we're also excited about this. I think one of the things that we see, especially for people who are sort of dealing with multiple systems, is that it just takes a lot of work to access resources. Even with this rental relief program that's, there's a ton of money available as households really struggle to pay the rent during COVID, but only half of that money has been tapped into because oftentimes there's such a burden, the amount of paperwork, or even with things like CalFresh benefits, you have to go see your eligibility worker once every couple months. So I think, there's a lot of really innovative things happening around what would it mean to just give people the resources that they need to access housing, to access healthy food, instead of having them navigate all of these systems in a really complex way. So we're investing in some pilots too, especially around transition age youth who have experienced foster care. What would it mean to, instead of, again, having them meet with a social worker once a month, or getting all of these different services from different places, what would it mean to just give them cash assistance? And so it's something we're really excited to learn more about in the years ahead. And I know last week, Los Angeles County launched a guaranteed income pilot where I think the application just closed in the last couple of days. So we're also investing in some research of some of these projects. And we hope that we can really widely share what we learn and hopefully start to replicate this if we see that it has positive impact in people's lives.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And
sorry,
Kristen,
Adriana, can I just add one thing there?
yes,
in the report, there is a box on the Stockton Universal Basic Income project, and we did talk in that about other projects and what sort of the research shows so far in terms of universal basic income. And one important thing I think is that I think people have the concern that it will make people less likely to work. There's no evidence that that's the case. People are spending the money on food, on basic living things. They are saying things like, it's wonderful because now we can get through to the end of the month without running out of food. And just the kind of quotes from people who participated were very, just profoundly touching. One mother wrote, I don't want to be the parent who's always saying no. And now I can be the one who sometimes says yes, and not yes to some giant thing, yes to an ice cream cone, So just the idea of taking the incredible pressure off families that this kind of program can provide is really, really encouraging and promising, I think.
Thank you, Kristen. So I know the link to the full report was added to the chat box. I definitely encourage everybody to go and read more about universal basic income and everything else that Kristen has presented today. But to make sure we finish on time, we're gonna do our final comments from the panel and close up this conversation. So Henry, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our webinar participants and to close us off?
Yeah, I just want to echo just what I said earlier, just about let's not let the studies or this webinar be the end of the conversation on human development, but let's continue to work together. So I know Measure of America is planning some community conversations throughout the state over the next coming weeks and months. And maybe we can take a hybrid approach in terms of being able to do it virtually and safely in person. We know it's incredibly challenging for us right now, but I think being able to have the vision of 2030 in mind in terms of what can we do collectively, for example, in communities of Fresno or the Inland Empire, what do we want of our communities over in 2030 in terms of what can we do to improve life expectancy? What can we do to increase our educational index scores? And what can we do to uplift income over the next few years? So we know that there's external pressures among us, and there's a great chart in the Human Development in Portrait of California, which intersects the gross domestic product with median household earnings, and realistically we haven't gotten a raise for a middle class in over 4 decades. So what are some of the things that we can do both statewide and locally to help improve those outcomes? So those are great conversations we're looking forward to having too.
Thank you, Henry. And Emily, what are your closing remarks?
Well, first, thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Henry. And thanks to the whole Measure of America team for having us here today. And thanks for the over 150 participants who are listening in. I think really what I take from this report is that the numbers, the data that we're seeing, it's all a result of choices that we've made. And that in the next couple of years, we get to make choices in our response to the public health, economic, and housing crisis of COVID-19. And this report really makes clear to us the communities that are both historically and still today most impacted by structural racism, by environmental health hazards, and economic and educational inequity. And these are the communities that are going to have the steepest climb to recovery in the years ahead. So this report gives us clear data around where our investments could be best targeted in order to bring us to a California that provides actual opportunity for all of our residents. So I think at this moment, we can choose to use that information and what we're hearing from the most impacted communities and target our recovery in a way that addresses many of our past failures. And that means that the real benefits of being a Californian are made real to all of us.
Thank you, Emily and Henry. I just have to say, like, for everybody listening today, this is a great resource and a tool that we all have now. And we can use it in a variety of ways, whether it is to share with our stakeholders and provide the evidence that sometimes people ask in order for us to advance strategies, work, investment, whatever it might be in your case. Use it, share it, take from it everything that you need to make a case that specifically communities of color, as we see, really need the support, and that we need to build equity in any program that we run, in any strategy that we design, and that we can't ignore the truth, right? Because it's in that report. I want to also thank the Measure of America team for putting this together, for all the work that has gone into the report, and for this event to make sure that our community knows that, you know, there's this information out there and we want to share that with you. Thank you to everybody that's joined, that shared questions or thoughts, or engaged with the panel or with any of the presenters today. I hope that you enjoy your time with us, and I'm going to give it back to Kristen to end the program for today. Thank you so much for letting me facilitate.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Adriana, for giving this wonderful, lively conversation to all of us. And thank you, Emily and Henry, for your perspectives, also your kind words. We really appreciate it. Just to say a little bit about what's coming next, we do have these more focused small reports that are part of the overall project, Portrait of California project, Sonoma County, in the Inland Empire, the San Joaquin Valley, Del Norte and Mendocino counties. Those are all definitely happening over the coming months. We are also super open. If anybody wants any other supplements, just let us know. We're also going to be writing a report on youth disconnection in Los Angeles in the first half of next year. So that's another thing that's coming. Henry mentioned this idea of some visioning meetings and exercises. A lot of times we try to end these reports with a positive vision because of COVID and because we weren't actually meeting with people. We worried a little bit about the legitimacy of that kind of process. We want to be much more involved with people. So that is also coming. And also there'll be a Spanish language version of Portrait of California. It will be up soon. So that is coming, as are more interviews with different people. That will also be on our site. On our site, we're also going to have an interactive map where you can see Human Development Index scores by place. So in closing, I just wanted to once again thank our wonderful panelists, our funders, our advisory board, and the MOA team who put this together. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today to hear about the report and for the many good ideas that you share today. And I hope that you'll keep them coming. Just write to us, contact@Measure of America. We'd love to hear what you say. And just to end, we've been spending a lot of time identifying differences among different groups of Californians. So I'd just like to end with a quote from Dr. King about what we all share. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. So our report really shows that residents from different California communities have access to really different sets of opportunities and face very different challenges. But in fundamental ways, our lives in California are interdependent. The boundaries between us are permeable and our fates are linked. Also, the inherent worth and dignity of every person is equal in measure. So we do this work because we believe that everybody counts, and we know all of you do as well. So thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to working together in the future. Bye, everybody.